So our next presentation is actually brought to you by our platinum sponsor today, Martin Funeral Home. You're going to actually be hearing from Adam Martin, who is the funeral home director. He's actually a third-generation funeral home director. Lots of great information. Here's his contact information. They serve the following communities: Mount Morris, Flint, Clio, Burton, North Branch, Vassar, Fairgrove, Essexville, and Grand Blanc. But a lot of the services that he's going to talk about to you today apply to anywhere. So Adam's going to be a great resource for you for prepaid funerals in regards to Medicaid planning. So I'd like to introduce to you Adam Martin.
So what button do I push?
This one.
That one?
Yep.
Now if I leave, are you going to cry?
I'll be right there. No, you're good.
All right. Thank you, everybody. I'd like to thank everyone from Mannor Law for, again, placing me right after the lunch hour, because I know talking about funerals and things like that is riveting as it is, and a full belly for the food. Well, we'll try and keep it relatively short today. The lunch was great. I very much appreciated that, and I appreciate the great introduction. So my name's Adam Martin. This is our, I think, third or fourth year being a part of this boot camp, and we've really enjoyed it. Hopefully you've had a chance to stop by our table and see some of the things that we brought today. And we'll be available, obviously, for the rest of the afternoon should you still have some questions or some questions about some of the things that I'll be discussing today. So have some things that are very specific to the slides that we're going to talk about, and then have some things that are added on at the end, too, regarding some benefits that we've just signed up for with our veterans funeral care. So we're going to specifically talk about the burial and funeral expenses that are excludable assets from Medicaid. So there are essentially three different funding vehicles that would be used to help a family prepay for a funeral and to be used as non-countable assets for Medicaid qualification. So the first one we're going to discuss is the non-associated life policy, then the funeral trust, and then the funeral policy, which is essentially a specialized insurance policy. Pardon me. So the first one would be a traditional policy, traditional life insurance policy that someone would have bought at some point in their life. So, my dad had bought a life insurance policy in the early 80s, and at some point when he would need to be working towards Medicaid qualifications, that could be considered a countable asset for him to qualify for Medicaid. What they can do is take that insurance policy with some criteria that's mentioned here. The most important one, that the dollar amount of the death benefit be mirroring the dollar amount of the funeral bill, and then that can be actually irrevocably assigned towards the funeral home, meaning that a spouse like my mom or myself or something like that was not the actual beneficiary of the policy. The funeral home would be the beneficiary of the policy. It's not overly common for that scenario to take place, just because of the fact that someone may have a term life policy which is expired, or they've purchased a whole life policy and they're still making payments on it, and it's too high of a dollar amount perhaps to correlate with the price of a funeral and things like that. And with insurance policies, it's one thing where if you have a $30,000 insurance policy, you can't call up the insurance company 27 years after you took the policy out and can you say, just make it a $10,000 policy now or a $5,000 policy. So it is one of the options that is available there, though I would say, well, if I've seen hundreds of pre-need contracts coming through in front of us or through our doors over the years, that would certainly be probably less than 1% in all honesty. But it is certainly an option that is valid and it can be explored. A lot of times it's good to not have to cash that policy out and things like that. The second two options are both kind of correlating, coming in and meeting with someone at a funeral home, determining what funeral you wanted to purchase, what type of funeral you wanted, whether it was a traditional burial, something with military honors, something a little more simple in terms of a cremation, a traditional cremation, maybe cremation without services, and paying for those services in advance by entering into a contract with the funeral home. So there's essentially a funeral trust and a funeral insurance policy. Ultimately, the difference in how that works from a funeral perspective and from a pre-funding perspective is nearly identical. It's just one of them would be placed into a trust that would be managed by a third party, not the funeral home, and the money would be invested for the hope that the death benefit would grow over time, and then one of them would be into a increasing death benefit life insurance policy. So we'll start off by talking about the trust. Both of them would have to be made irrevocable to be qualified as a not an asset in terms of qualifying for Medicaid. So there's actually two types of trusts out there. Again, a majority of the time when we're talking with families, they do not use a revocable trust. The easiest example I would say of a revocable trust is if someone perhaps does not have the financial means to pay for a funeral all at once, nor do they have the financial, or excuse me, nor can they pass any health questions to qualify for an insurance. So just like a traditional insurance policy, my wife is going through kind of working with insurance now, and she spends, an hour on the phone answering all these medical family history questions and things like that. But if someone is, been diagnosed with cancer or they're of ill health and things like that, the underwriters are not going to give them an insurance policy. So you can come in and do a trust, but you maybe only can make X amount of dollar of payments at a time. So I might be able to afford $100 that I could pay you, or I might be able to pay you $50 6 weeks from now, or maybe something happened where a car was sold or some kind of asset was sold and I could pay $1,000, and we'll take these little chunks of money and apply them to what's called a revocable trust. Now, typically after that dollar amount gets a little bit higher, a portion of that could be transferred over to an irrevocable trust and then would be an excluded asset. So somebody gets up to $1,000 and they decide that they want to specifically earmark that $1,000 to cover this casket or a burial vault or their funeral service and visitation or whatever that may be. It can be shifted over pretty easily at most times and then be moved over to that excluded asset column. In addition to that, you can also come in, and if a family is in a spend down or type of crisis situation where they need to, take care of managing their assets right away, they could come in, plan a full funeral, have X amount of dollars, or say $7,500 for that funeral, take care of the entire payment all at once, it would be immediately made irrevocable and then an excluded asset. I always feel lucky when I come up here because I feel like some of the stuff that I talk about is far simpler than the stuff that the rest of everyone talks about. The irrevocable contract has a certain dollar amount in the state of Michigan, so it can't exceed a cap that is set every year by the Detroit Consumer Price Index, if I recall that correctly. This is a little old, as is from last year, so this year I believe the total on June 1st is going up to $13,020. So it doesn't move up too much over time. I want to say in my 20-plus years in funeral service, it's maybe moved up a couple $1,000s, I think, over 23, 22 years, something along those lines. So a little bit at a time, but it does move up. And of course, that's just increasing with the increasing cost of funerals and things like that. Excuse me, I can't clear my throat here. In order for prepaid funeral contracts to be qualified, or go back a slide here, excluded, they must be set up through the Department of Human Health and Human Services, and we have to fill out this wonderful form here, which looks like a whole lot of things, but again, I say is much, much simpler than most of the forms that we have discussed already today, and it's actually quite simple. It could be taken care of when someone came in to do a brand new trust or a new insurance policy. It's very common for, to be working with Mannor Law and we're working with someone's assets. They're trying to help them out. They say, oh yeah, we do have a prearrangement. My, mom did it 10, 15 years ago at Martin Funeral Home. Do you know if it's irrevocable? No, I don't. Call the funeral home up. We just simply fill out our portion of this, get it sent over to family, sign for it, send it to department, and then it's all signed for and taken care of. So it's a pretty straightforward process. A few phone calls, scan an email, and it's all set. So it can be done at the time you would do a new prearrangement, a pre-funded funeral, or it could be used to cover an existing one. Those are the trusts. The funeral policy option, again, the main difference between the two is that the trust doesn't require any type of health questions, and an insurance policy always does. Both a trust and a funeral policy are going to guarantee the cost of funeral goods and services. So the easiest way for me to explain that I would use to explain to new folks that work for us or for family members is that irregardless of how many years the policy is in existence and how much money either A, the death benefit increases on that trust or the policy versus how much the funeral may increase by, it's paid for no matter what. So if I came in using easy math and I bought a funeral today that was $5,000 and I gave the funeral home $5,000 for what my services are, it's all covered. I passed away in 2025, say that money has raised to $6,000, but the funeral services is now $6,500. Family is going to get that exact $6,500 or exactly what they paid for, even though there's only $6,000 available. So that's a state law in the state of Michigan that we have to guarantee the things that we as a funeral home are in control of the prices are. So our services, merchandise, vehicles, things like that. Now, if the opposite is true, where the money raised up to $7,000 and the price of the funeral is still $6,500, family could, if it was irrevocable, use that to spend on something else, but they can't get it back. Okay, there's either paid back to the state of Michigan because things were irrevocable to qualify for Medicaid, or they could use it to purchase towards a headstone maybe that was not planned for, or maybe flowers for the service or a funeral luncheon or something like that. So it can be used. Now, if it's not made irrevocable for things like that, then the family could just get that money back too. But in terms of majority of what we're talking about today, that money would just be used for other things, maybe an obituary notice or something along those lines. I did mention the health questions. There can be some payment options. So that specific time there, if someone, again, doesn't have the funds to pay $6,000, $2,000, whatever, as soon as they walk in the door, there can be payment plans just like traditional insurance policies, 2 years, 5 years, 7 years, things along that lines. It can be made irrevocable using that form or using the specific form provided by the insurance company, and it is just as easy to do so as I mentioned. Send it over. I say fax it over, but fax is a kind of a passé thing nowadays. But email, we can do things with digital signatures and have it all taken care of. And there is optional ways to guarantee some of the third-party items as well. So third-party things, just to clarify that, would be some of the charges that we as a funeral home would usually help a family or discuss with a family that you would need to have to complete a full funeral. If somebody's going to be buried, typically there would be cemetery charges or an honorarium for a minister or something along those lines. Those would not be our charges; they would be considered third-party charges. But we would certainly work with the family to give them a very realistic view of okay, the funeral home's going to be $5,000, but we don't talk about the rest of the stuff, even though it might be $1,200 just for opening and closing of the grave and things like that. So those can be a part of that as well. This slide right here, is one of the ones I call you have to reread it 88 times to actually understand what it's saying, and it's one of those where you realize that sometimes legislation makes no sense and makes things far more difficult than they actually have to be. But sometimes there are instances where a spouse would apply for an irrevocable contract knowing full well that they will be denied in order for the person to be specifically going on Medicaid to be approved to go on Medicaid. Okay, so you have to go through all of the steps, even though you know that the denial is going to be given at the end. Makes a lot of sense. They're more of the experts on why it's written that way than I am, but you do have to go through those steps sometimes to make those accounts excluded from Medicaid. Oops, I pushed the wrong button there. In addition to all of that, there are exclusions called burial space exclusions. So anything that could be utilized to purchase for your family members that would be considered something that's used at the cemetery or the burial space can be also excluded assets. So you could theoretically, if I was spending down and I had 5 or 6 kids, I could buy a grave space for my 5 or 6 kids. I could prepay for the opening and closing for my 5 or 6 kids. I could purchase a burial vault for my 5 or 6 kids. I could buy a marker for all 5 of them. and whatnot, and those are considered excluded assets as well. So that's an opportunity, on a decision that you'd have to work with, your family, certainly working with an attorney, planning things, and working with your funeral home to see what to extent you would want to do something like that. Yes, ma'am. Funerals, no. Specifically grave items, yes. So that's why I say it has to be the spaces at the cemetery, a vault that would go on the ground at the cemetery, a marker at the cemetery. You could theoretically pre-plan for each of the graveside services for your kids to have a bagpiper, no matter how many years in the future it would plan for, but it's not for anything that's for the funeral services. One of the Pardon me. One other thing I want to say before I move on to some of our veterans programs that we have to offer too is that, do you have a question?
So you were saying for like, grave items,
Uh-huh.
etc.
If you were to bury the cremated remains, yes. Yes. Yep.
Not the actual cremation.
Correct. Yes. I don't want to say that it covers a lot, but if you have multiple family members, multiple spouses of children and things like that, you certainly can set those things up for them. Yeah. One of the forms that we had at our table today that I always like to point out, and many of you in the room may know about this, since it's 3 years old now, but it's still relatively new because it was really talked about in circles of funeral homes, but not a lot elsewhere, is a rule that Michigan just implemented called the funeral designee rule. So oftentimes we were running into issues where a son was a power of attorney for his mom. And he comes into the funeral home thinking that he can do all of the decisions and sign all of the paperwork and things like that because I've been power of attorney for 2 years, 5 years, 10 years, things like that. Well, power of attorney only exists when someone is living. So as soon as someone dies, power of attorney ceases because the whole purpose for the power of attorney is to take care of that living person. So that oftentimes throws a significant wrench into the plans where not that many times family members do agree on things, but when it comes to cremation in the state of Michigan, the rule is that a majority of equal relations have to sign and physically sign and authorize a cremation. So if there were 5 kids, 3 kids would have to sign the form. 7 kids, 4 kids would have to sign the form. And when Mr. Power of Attorney or Mrs. Power of Attorney comes in and thinks they can just sign whatever they need to sign, and I'm the guy who says, nope, sorry, it doesn't work that way anymore. Well, what do you mean? It's worked that way for 4 years. Well, it doesn't anymore. Sorry. So the state recognized and funeral homes recognized that this was kind of a roadblock and confusing to people and things like that. So they initiated a funeral designee. So it's a very simple form, 2 or 3 pages that can appoint one person or 1 or 2 or 3 people to be able to take care of those signatures and make those decisions on behalf of family members. Of course, many of you are aware today, it's rare that everyone's child is going to live in Genesee County. 40 years ago, everybody lived pretty close to one another, but, my sister lives in New York, and, many people have, for jobs and for other reasons, just moved to various parts of the state, and there's 1 or 2 or 3 maybe kids that are back here that are helping or, rotating help with mom or dad or something along those lines, and it's a very easy thing to have those 2 or 3 that are local or 1 or 2 that are local be appointed as the funeral designee, and when it comes to cremation, they're the only ones that would actually have to sign that document instead of trying to track down kids that are scattered all around the country. Again, not that that's sometimes overly difficult because email and fax machines and things like that make that pretty easy. But, if you're like us and every single family you meet with always gets along perfectly and everybody agrees on everything all the time, which of course is obviously the exception to the rule. But it does make things a little bit simpler for the family. Can be taken care of any time before someone passes away, kept on file. It just needs to be notarized. There's nothing else that needs to be done. It doesn't have to be filed with any type of entity or anything like that, just notarized. That could be kept at a funeral home. It could be kept with the person's documents, brought into a funeral home, and that would authorize XYZ person to take care of the It could be, you don't like any of your kids, so you want your neighbor to take care of things. Could be done that way too. It's a nice feature. We were running into issues where, if there's a surviving spouse, it's relatively simple. If there's kids, it's usually relatively simple, but sometimes there are someone who's never married and they have a large family. Maybe they're, those good old Catholic families where they had like 11 kids. Well, maybe this person was the one that never got married, never had any kids, and maybe he's the last of those 11 kids, but he's got 47 nieces and nephews. So now I have to get 24 signatures. Yes. Where does that, on this up here or somewhere else? Oh, I'm sorry. Yes, I did not touch on that. I skipped over that line. So that a funeral insurance policy or a trust would be transferable to any funeral home in the country. So if you came in and you met with us and you did an entire funeral policy, prepaid for it and everything, Michigan's one of the better states in terms of consumer protection with pre-funded funerals for protecting people's assets. So if you came in and you met with me, you wouldn't be writing a check out to Martin Funeral Home or anything like that. You'd be writing a check out to the trust company or directly to the insurance company. And then you retired and moved to Florida and you're going to live there. You wouldn't have to actually do anything upon death. Your kids would just simply contact the insurance company. They would pay that funeral home. That's what that is, yes. Sorry, I skipped over that. Yes, ma'am. Yes. Yes. Yeah, it does. After someone dies is the only time in which those authorizations can be signed, not before. So if I wanted to be cremated, I died, my wife would actually have to sign my cremation authorization. My wishes, albeit expressed in any way, shape, or form, that's why that funeral designee is an important piece, can be changed at any time after death. So I could have told every single person that I know, I could have written it in my will, I could have written it in my trust, I could have written it everywhere that I want to be cremated, but the next of kin of the deceased has the ultimate decision in deciding what to do with the body after it has died. Still has to be signed for, yes, by the next of kin. Yeah, usually wakes them up, doesn't it? Yeah. Go ahead, you can go.
Not worried, but wondering, the funeral policy, is it transferable? Are the trusts?
Yes, they are, yes.
Yeah, what if you're estranged from your children and seen them like over 20 years and don't have any real contact?
They would still have to sign unless there was a designee. Yeah. That's why they came up with the law a couple years ago, because those were the situations that us as funeral homes were getting placed in many, many times over and over. The ultimate answer to that is, sadly, we live in a somewhat litigious society. And if I died and I was cremated and my daughter decided after she hadn't talked to me for 20 years, which God willing does not happen, that she wants to sue the funeral home and sue the crematory and sue all parties involved because she didn't sign that authorization and she has, a heartache that she can't resolve because she wanted me to be buried and couldn't see me or couldn't go to my grave and things like that, that could be brought against the funeral home and the crematory. I mean, the only option at that point would be for the family to consider doing a burial or body donation or something like that. Yeah. Mm-hmm. If you have the designee form signed, that signature can be appointed to whoever's name is on that designee form. Anyone. within rule, they can't let me as a funeral home owner sign it. There's certain exclusions, yeah. Correct, yes, yes. So, if you know we've had situations where people come in and I want this and I know my kids are going to change my wishes or I don't want nothing to do with them, and they'll assign a family friend or their brother or sister or something like that as the funeral designee, and that document would trump that relation hierarchy, I guess is the best way to put it in the state, yeah. So, any more questions on that? I will be at the table, yes ma'am. No, there's actually a form that needs to be filled out and it needs to be notarized. But it doesn't need to be filed anywhere, things like that. It just needs to be kept on hand, yes. All right, very good. So that federal designee form, one thing that I wanted to just talk about, I got 2 or 3 minutes left here, is that over the last few months, we have become part of the Veterans Funeral Care Network, which is a group of funeral homes across the United States that are really that's trying to help us understand how we can better serve veterans in our communities and better offer service to veterans and learn some of the details that are somewhat confusing. They alluded to a little bit earlier today, not so much for benefits for veterans prior to them passing away, but things that we could help with after they died, some reimbursements that could be help being applied for and things like that. Not that we are more knowledgeable than the folks at the Holly Veterans Conference Center, but there's a lot there. So the first thing, and many of you picked this up, I always like to point out, even though I think a majority of people know this, we spent some time and called around to a majority of the cemeteries in Genesee County alone and determined that average of a price to be buried at a private cemetery for 2 people, for a veteran and a spouse. So over $10,000 to go to your average private cemetery. There could be local township cemeteries that could be quite a few $1,000 less than that. There could be larger, bigger corporate cemeteries that could be quite a bit more than that. And it's just a really powerful slide, I think, to show the benefits that all of our veterans, their spouses, their dependent family members have earned to be buried at a very wonderful and beautiful national cemetery that we have here in our backyard for nothing. So I always like to point that out, making sure that if you're working with veterans or making sure that it's a standard question, are you a veteran? Is your husband a veteran? Was your dad a veteran? And things like that, because there's a lot of benefit to that. That is certainly one of the largest benefits. We also have a couple of programs that part of the reason that I was very intrigued by this Veterans Funeral Care Network because of their Retire Your Flag program. So there's lots of entities, oftentimes American Legion, VFW Post, working with Boy Scouts and things like that will be collecting old tattered flags, and they have ceremonies that they'll retire those flags, usually by burning and things like that. This was a program that was developed by the founder of that Veterans Funeral Care Network, by which in collecting those flags, we would take and drape those flags over the body of a veteran that was going to be cremated. So not a new flag, not their burial flag that would be given to them or their next of kin upon death, but an old flag that was not worthy to be flown anymore, something like that. And it's a way that we feel that, number one, we can retire the flag with dignity, and I think even more importantly, that we can honor that veteran one last time. So that's our big barrel over there of flag collecting. That's that program, which I thought was very meaningful. We've shared that with a lot of families, when we return their cremated remains to them and we explain to them what we've done, and their kind of eyes start welling up with some tears and things like that. It's kind of a very powerful program. And then another program that we will be working on in the late summer and fall, moving into winter, is a program called Operation Toy Soldier. So the easiest way I can probably explain this is it's very similar to Toys for Tots. However, this one would specifically have a focus on veterans and their families, oftentimes younger families that may have kids, and maybe the wife or mom or dad or somebody like that is actively deployed or away or overseas, and during the holidays they may struggle a little bit. So it's an operation that we can get toys, gift cards, things like that, and help make their holidays a little special too moving forward. So that's that program as well. So 2 of those that we're involved with. And then also I mentioned too, there's a lot of training that we received that we can help families apply for some of those benefits. Again, not prior to death, but after death. I shared with a couple of folks that I was surprised. My dad was receiving a little bit of money from VA before he died, and I didn't really think much of it because he certainly probably died from complications of, well, it was lungs, but I don't know if it was being a fireman or smoking or being an embalmer or being in Vietnam. All of those, he didn't really do a good treatment to his lungs over the years, but he was receiving a very small monthly amount from VA, and I didn't know that he was not buried in the National Cemetery. He was buried in his church cemetery with all of his family, but because he was receiving money, we could have applied to VA to perhaps have the price of that grave, even though it was purchased many years ago, reimbursed up to a dollar amount because he was receiving some money. So there's some things out there where you could get back $300, $500, $700, $1,000 for a veteran, even though they didn't die in a VA hospital or because of dying because of a specific VA-related illness or injury, or certainly not active duty, covering some transportation charges. Most funeral homes would have a fee for a hearse to go from the funeral home or the church to the cemetery. Sometimes those can be reimbursed and things like that. So it's kind of a nice thing for us to have knowledge of, and that we would certainly want to share with everybody. So please keep us in mind for those things. And then there's my not so nice picture anymore up there, and I think that I am all done. So I appreciate your attention and your questions, and please let me know if you have any more.
Thank you so much, Adam. We really appreciate you being here.
Next time you're doing it.
I don't think so. We're going to draw a few more prizes before we bring up take a quick break.